Hello and welcome to episode 3 in my Let's Code series. In this one I'm going to be talking a little about variables, from what they are and do and how to keep track of them. Before that, however, I'd like to give a big shout out to my supporters on all platforms. You guys are the reason I'm able to do this. So how deep will this rabbit hole go? Well, as much as it would be fun to create a multi-part series talking about packing and unpacking multiple variables, I intend to keep the information more specific to the variable types commonly found in visual novels and the RENPY engine. Let's start by creating a new file. We'll do it under scripts, so if we right click, new file, and this one we'll call variables.rpy. Let's start with a simple definition. A variable is a container for storing a data value. Think of it as a box. On the outside is printed the label box 1. Inside is a brown shoe. So long as the contents are not changed, you know that in the container marked box 1 is a brown shoe. As such, when someone asks where the brown shoe is, you know and can say it's in the variable or container labelled box 1. Most visual novels will use two variable types. These are variable underscore name equals value and define. So these are two types. The first variable is an example of what you would call a normal variable. It's going to be the bread and butter of your visual novel and is the main way you will keep track of events as they play out. The second variable, define, is a static variable. Although this can be changed, it's generally understood and accepted best practice that once a variable has been defined, it doesn't get changed in code. It may help if you think of them as defines rather than as variables. As an aside, the dollar symbol is just a replacement for writing Python. So let's put the defines aside for now and focus on the first variable type. There are three types of variable values: Boolean, integer, and string. Let's create a Boolean and integer variable. Let's create my spelling is terrible. And then zero. The first example is a Boolean and the second is an integer. Boolean variables are a simple true or false statement. For example, if spied on these is equals true, I saw you spy on me. The two equals here means is equal to. This is different to how you set a variable, as shown. Make note that true and false are case sensitive. True with a lowercase letter is not the same and will cause you errors. There are other ways to use this variable. For example, if spied on these is true, again with a capital letter. And we can also have if spied on these what you saw. Both of these statements are the same as this first one. However, it's probably better to include either is true or is equal to true rather than omitting it, because if you do so, RENPY will assume that you're checking if it's true. The same applies to false. You can have if not spied on these. Need to make it a string. You outside the door. And of course, if spied on these, it's false. Thought in. Again, you can also use the two equal signs to denote is equal to, in this case, false. The second variable, rel count, is an integer. Integers are numbers that could be used to track stats or other variables that would increase or decrease, like relationship points, as an example. So let's do that. Increase count by 1. Two hashes here, or actually a single hash will do it, but I always use two, means comment. And so we would use rel count plus equals 1. And this will increase the rel count by 1. Let's learn to spell. Let's say we want to decrease count by 3. We would use rel count minus equals 3. We can use this integer to influence events in the game. For example, if rel count is greater than 5, jump Louise date. And we can use the else. If it's anything other than that, jump home alone. The third variable value is string. A string is text and is denoted by two speech marks. This is a string. So let's look at one of the first things most visual novel games ask you to do, and that's naming the main character. To start with, we use Python. I use Python instead of the $sign because I'm using multiple lines of code, and it's easier and more efficient to use Python once than a $sign. So we want name equals renpy.input. Please name your character. Name. If we set that to 14 and exclude equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and plus and minus. The exclude, you can have any symbol in there as you see fit. So this first line, it sets the value of name by calling renpy.input, which is a text input field with the string or text title, please name your character. The player can then enter their name, but will not be able to use the text characters contained in the exclude, just there, and the length will be limited to 14 characters. So on the next line, name equals strip. We need to do name.strip. What this does is it will take the name that you enter and it will strip out any blank spaces, so any space bars will get removed. If not, name John Doe. This part is triggered if the player presses enter without adding any text. It will use the default name of John Doe. Finally, we need to add assistant n equals name. This final line will save the value for name into the player's persistent save file. This means the name will persist through replays that are accessed outside of the main game loop. Persistent variables are something I will cover in another video. Once we have that set, we need to use the define variable type to set the main character's character name, like so. Define MC equals dynamic character name, it's lowercase, yeah, color equals F8D2CA. This is the color I use in my own game. Here we use define as the character's name is static and should not change. We use dynamic character because we want the value of the variable name as set by the player to be used as opposed to actually calling the main character name. Character names that have not been input by the player do not use the dynamic character, and instead, as detailed previously, they use this. You can add a colour to this as well. You don't have to, but it helps players identify each character in your games. Finally, I want to cover the use of default. Due to the development of a lot of visual novels, they tend to be released in several updates rather than as a whole, complete and finished program. Variables are set the first time they are used. As such, if you go back to a prior release and add a variable, anyone past that point loading a save will not have that variable set. To explain that further, let's say, for example, you have Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 released. During the development of Chapter 3, you decide that a choice early on in Chapter 1 is important. So you create a variable and go back into Chapter 1 and add it, setting it to true. When you release Chapter 3, any player who has a save game past the point where the variable is called in Chapter 1 will run into traceback errors when you try to use that variable in Chapter 3, because in their game state it doesn't exist. This player would have to start the game from the beginning, something that really annoys players, especially if the game is quite long in development. There are ways to mitigate this. Firstly, you can use default to set the variable to a value that will be loaded every time the game loads. In fact, you should default every variable you use, as it will prevent a lot of errors. Where I've been using the Python $, that should really be set to default. To do that, all we need to do is default spied on these false. Again, just the one equals sign there. This means that no matter what state of save the player has, this variable will always be set before the game loop starts. Any players that have a save where this variable has changed to true will overwrite the default value. You can also use spied on these is equal to none. Spied on these equals false. this does exactly the same as default. However, what this doesn't and can never fix is if you've changed the default of the variable in existing code and later rely on it to be set to a new branching path. The only way to fix this is to find an alternative variable and use that to set the correct value of the new variable, or outright break the fourth wall and ask players, "Did you spy on Louise?" and set the variable then. How to prevent this? Add a variable to every choice, even if you think it won't be that important. All too often I've heard developers bemoan the fact that a small choice in Act 1 can change the whole outcome of the story and it doesn't have a variable attached. That about covers it for this video. It's quite an information dump, but hopefully I've explained it clear enough. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below or hit me up on Discord. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.